Eating meat right off the bone just tastes better. Ribs are glorious, but they can also be a bit confusing. They come in all shapes and sizes, have all sorts of different names, and should all be cooked slightly differently. But have no fear, today we're doing a deep dive. By the end of this video, you'll understand each type of rib, where they come from, and how to cook them so that you become a rib master. And as usual, at the end of this video, we'll be testing my meat knowledge with a completely blind taste test to see how many I can get right. Let's get started. Ribs are actually my favorite food, so needless to say, I am super pumped for this video. But just like humans, all animals have ribs. We got this rib cage right here. They protect the internal organs. They're super tasty, and they all share one fact in that they're all quite tough. So they're the type of cut that needs to be broken down and tenderized. And we will start by going over all of the pork ribs. Baby backs are generally quite small ribs, but they are extremely meaty, specifically over the top. On the back side, you can see how those bones are characterized as having that pretty intense curvature to them, since they're taken from up closer towards the spine. Believe it or not, baby backs actually come from the exact same part of the animal as a bone-in pork roast. As you can see, these are taken from the exact same part. The only difference is with a bone-in roast, we have those ribeye muscles over the top. Even though baby backs are sometimes considered the more lean rib, when cooked correctly, they're still extremely tender and juicy. And at least for me, they sort of have that nostalgic element to them. I ate these all the time growing up, and I'll always love them. And next up we have the spare ribs. As you can see, these are way bigger than the baby back, and they're kind of cool because they actually sort of have like two cuts in one. We have the St. Louis ribs right here, as well as those rib tips down below. What I'm gonna do now is remove the rib tips to expose the St. Louis. All it is finding that cartilage here and trimming them away just like so. And what we're left with here are the rib tips. As you can see, it still has that cartilage in there. To me, these are pretty underrated. Like, people tend to shy away from them. I think they're absolutely delicious. But most importantly, we're also left with our St. Louis cut spare ribs. Now these here are like the ribs rib. It's what you see people use when they're cooking competition style. They're super uniform, so they cook well, they're meaty, they're well marbled, and pretty much the perfect rib. And just to show you guys the comparison here, we have baby backs and St. Louis. You can see the baby backs have a lot more of a curve to them. They're also a bit thicker, whereas the St. Louis are a bit wider and super flat. And just another cool visual, if you imagine the spine being right here, we have the baby backs directly connected to it, and then you have those St. Louis as the extension. But here's the thing about these ribs. They take a ridiculous amount of time to make, and they're not the most convenient. That is why I am very excited to share that the sponsor of today's video is Cookunity. Sometimes cooking for myself is a little inconvenient, and I end up spending way too much on delivery. But for the past few months, I've been using Cookunity, and it has completely changed the way I eat. It's the first chef-to-consumer platform delivering freshly prepared food to your door. It's super easy to select your meals, and the options are endless with over 7 dietary preferences. There's even vegan options, but I'm not sure if those are for me. My favorite so far has been the Barbecue Heritage Pork Chop by Chef John DeLucia, and I love that there are some healthy, high-protein chicken and seafood dishes on there as well. They're really just the perfect post-workout meal. These are legit handcrafted chef-made meals made with real healthy ingredients. The best part is they're pre-cooked, so no more cleanup and meal planning. Today I'm having gochujang pulled pork bows by Chef Fabiola Rivera, made in Brooklyn, New York. I mean, just check out those buns. They're perfect. Each meal is made by chefs who specialize in different cuisines, so I get to experience foods that I would never make myself. It's a super flexible meal service too. You can try something new for every meal, skip weeks, and cancel whenever you want. Go to cookunity.com/MaxTheMeatGuy or click the link in the description and use MaxTheMeatGuy50 to get 50% off your first order of Cookunity meals to try them out for yourself. And let's get back to the video. Okay, and this is where things start to get a bit controversial. These here are country style ribs. And the thing about these ribs is there's actually no bone attached. In reality, these are actually just slices from the Boston butt, which is the shoulder. However, to many they are still considered ribs. There are no bones on it, but they still taste delicious. And for our last set of pork ribs, we have something that's actually completely new to me. I have never seen these nor cooked with them, so this is pretty cool, but we have pork short ribs. As you can see, they have 4 bones, which tells me that they're chuck short ribs, so they come from the front of the animal. They're just super meaty and actually look exactly like their beef counterparts. Here we have the pork short ribs, whereas on this side we have the beef short ribs. Obviously, the beef ones are significantly bigger, but the shape is identical. While this was my first time ever cooking pork short ribs, I have to say it will most certainly not be my last. They are extremely meaty, but still super juicy. And if you can find them, they're absolutely worth picking up. Next up, we are moving on to our beef ribs. And we are starting off strong with what some people consider to be the greatest bite in barbecue. We have the dino ribs. These are also known as the plate ribs, but as you can see, they are absolutely massive. We have 3 bones right here, and they are super well marbled and meaty. These ribs can be found towards the center of the cow, and they're actually the direct extension from the ribeye. So we have those ribeye muscles here, they follow down here, and with the 2 of them still connected, you'd have a tomahawk ribeye. The marbling on these things is just fantastic, and in my opinion, the best way to cook these is to smoke them. And by the time they're done, you can really see why they have the name dino ribs. These things are an absolute beast, extremely juicy. This right here is the reason why they always sell out first at barbecue restaurants. And next up we have the chuck short ribs. As opposed to the 3 bones we found on those plate ribs, these have 4, and you can also see how these are a lot shorter. As the name suggests, these come from the chuck, or closer to the front of the area right under the shoulder. They're still gonna be extremely meaty, but in my opinion, they're a little less premium than the dino plate ribs. There's just something about that giant bone on the dino rib that is hard to beat. And just for our reference, I'll bring back these dino ribs. If you can imagine this as being the front or the head of the animal, we have the chuck short ribs closest to it. Directly next to them, we have the dino ribs, and up here, we'd have the shoulder and then the ribeye muscles. Even though these are smaller and a bit less marbled than those dino ribs, as you can see, they are still absolutely phenomenal and worth giving a shot. And next up, we have flank and cut short ribs like this thicker one right here, as well as these super thin ones. All these are literally just a rack of short ribs cut perpendicularly to the bone. So as you can see, we have these tiny little nubs of bones and that beautiful meat running throughout. Believe it or not, these are actually my all-time favorite food, super popular in Korean barbecue, and that Korean marinade puts them over the top. You may have also seen these rectangular looking short ribs. These are called English cut, and they're really just the whole short ribs cut into little chunks. It's common to find these cut like this in supermarkets. My all-time favorite way to cook them is to actually braise them. So no smoking and no grill involved, but by the end of it, they are just absolutely melt in your mouth tender with that beautiful red wine sauce right on top. And last but not least, we have the beef back ribs. Now these are actually the baby back ribs on the cow. So they're from the exact same area. As you can see, they also have that nice curve to them, and they are super meaty. And for reference, if you imagine a whole prime rib or rib roast, it actually sits directly on top right here. Beef back ribs tend to fly under the radar just because they're a bit less meaty than something like the dino ribs. However, in my opinion, they still taste unbelievable, and they're typically a great value. All right, and for a final bonus rib, what we have here are lamb ribs. These are way more shrimpy and skinny than any of the other ones we've seen so far. But really, I just wanted to show these to remind people that every single animal has ribs. Elk, venison, lamb, literally every type of meat that we consume has ribs. While some are better than others, they can all be treated pretty much the same. As we get closer to finally cooking these ribs, it's time to talk about prepping them, and we'll start here with the pork ribs. Now, a lot of these pork ribs we talked about actually don't really need to be prepped. The tips, the country style, and this chuck one right here is pretty much just good to go. However, with these 2 racks here, there is a bit to do. Starting with our St. Louis cut ribs, see these are already trimmed up pretty good, but as you can see on the end here, we have kind of like a shard of bone. I like to remove that just to prevent any burning. We're nicely squared up. The last thing to do is consider removing this membrane right here. So a lot of people do like to remove it. However, it does come down to personal preference. If you do decide to remove it, the best way is to start in the middle and kind of work your finger in there. Be careful not to rip it if you can. And then since we started from the middle, all we need to do is move upwards, and it should come mostly off. In this case, there is a bit of leftover here. The easiest way to do it is to get a paper towel, just to make sure you have that nice grip, and it comes right off. And these St. Louis cut ribs are perfectly prepped. Let's talk about these baby backs. As you can see, we have a really thin little flap right there. That would definitely burn. Another little flap Now I talked about how removing the membrane is sort of a personal preference. You can either leave it on, you can take it off, but a third alternative is to actually make sort of incisions in it for a final product that's right in between the two. So all you have to do is use your knife and just make some striations, just to lightly slice through that membrane. This is gonna prevent that membrane from kind of sticking when you bite into it. There we go. All of our ribs are fully prepped and good to go. Now let's talk about prepping our beef ribs. Now, generally speaking, our flank and cut and also our beef back ribs really don't need anything done to them regardless of how you cook them. However, for our 2 racks, there is some prep to be done. Starting here with our dino ribs. The one thing you'll notice is a huge fat and silver skin cap right over the top. Now, because this cut is already so well marbled and fatty, we actually want to completely remove this for a tender bite. But it's going to allow us to build incredible bark directly on the meat. Our dino ribs are all cleaned up. They're looking perfect. Now moving on to the chuck short ribs, we are going to be doing the exact same thing. This one has just an insane amount of fat on here. Now we could leave it on there. However, we want the seasonings to stick directly to the meat so that when we bite it, we're not biting into a whole bunch of fat. And we also want that smoke to be able to penetrate and actually be exposed to meat and not just this fat. So we're gonna remove literally all of this. Now, one very important point when it comes to the plate ribs as well as the chuck short ribs, and it has to do with the membrane. Just like we saw with the pork ribs, beef ribs also have this membrane on that back side. Now we could remove it, however, removing it is a big no-no. When these things are cooking, we bring them up to such a high temperature that if we remove the membrane, all the bones would kind of separate and the whole thing would just fall apart. So anytime you're cooking a whole rack of beef ribs, always leave that membrane on. The chuck short rib is all cleaned up. The last ones we're gonna do some minor trimming on are these English cut short ribs. As you can see, they do have that silver skin over the top of them, and I'm just going to quickly remove that because it just does not taste very good. Let's move back on over to the pork. It is time to season. All right, and it is finally time to season our pork. The very first thing we need to decide is whether or not we're gonna use a binder, and if we do, which one we're gonna use. Here are 3 common options. The first thing we have over here is yellow mustard. Very common, works great. Over here we have just regular oil, obviously gonna give it a very neutral flavor. Also works fantastic. And lastly, you can use something a little bit more exciting, something like a Worcestershire, in this case, W sauce, my absolute favorite Worcestershire sauce. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, whether you use one and what you use doesn't make too much of a difference. Now let's talk about seasoning our ribs. When it comes to barbecue, I personally like to keep it extremely simple. So literally just 50% kosher salt and 50% black pepper, to me, is really all you need. However, pork is a good opportunity to use some of your favorite barbecue rubs. So anything that's paprika based or even has some sugar in it typically lends very well to pork. Sort of along the lines of salt and pepper, there's also something like this McCormick coarse black pepper and flake salt. Very similar, but it does include stuff like garlic powder in there. But really, all of these options work great. We'll start here with our baby backs. For the binder on this one, I'm gonna use a very thin layer of that yellow mustard. Just rub that right in and make sure to get both sides. Keep in mind, the binder is less to impart flavor, more so just to allow those seasonings to stick. By the time it's done cooking, pretty much none of that flavor is gonna be left over anyway. To go with these baby backs, I'm adding on a sweet barbecue rub. Next up, the St. Louis, and for this one, I'm going no binder. For the first layer, I'm just adding kosher salt. Now, please keep in mind, ribs are extremely thin, and we always want to avoid over seasoning them. So you can always start with less and add more later. Next, we'll add in our black pepper, and we'll get the back as well. Next up, the country style ribs. And for this one, we're gonna do a little oil binder and a barbecue rub. Next up, the pork short ribs. And for this one, we're going a little outside the box with some W sauce. And for the seasoning, I'm using Grill Mates coarse black pepper and flake salt. Very similar to just a basic salt and pepper. Simple, but one of my favorites. Last but not least, we have our rib tips. No binder on this, and just a bit more of that coarse black pepper and flake salt, almost like a Texas barbecue vibe to it. We'll let all this flavor start working on that meat, and let's move on to seasoning the beef. Once again, first step is the binder. I've always felt weird putting something like mustard on a beautiful piece of beef. So for me personally, I either use no binder or just oil. When it comes to seasoning the beef, I also like to keep it extremely simple. Unlike pork, I try to avoid using anything that has sugar, so salt and pepper or a salt and pepper based rub is all you need. We'll start with the beef back ribs. Once again, these are the baby backs on the cow. Once again, I'm using the coarse black pepper flake salt. Next, the chuck short rib. A little bit of oil. And unlike the pork ribs, these are a lot thicker, so they can actually take quite a bit of seasoning. Next up, the dino ribs. The exact same process. Boneless short rib, the English cut. We're actually gonna cook these in a very special way, which I'll show you later. And that should just about do it. We're actually not going to season the flanken style Korean ribs. We're gonna actually use a Korean marinade for these. So with that, our beef is seasoned. Okay, and with everything seasoned up, it is finally time to cook. We're gonna move back over to the pork, and what we're gonna be focusing on are the baby backs and the St. Louis cuts. We're gonna get them on the smoker, and the most common way to do it is something called the 3-2-1 method. So that's what we're gonna talk about first. The 3-2-1 method refers to 3 hours on the smoker, 2 hours wrapped in butcher's paper or tinfoil, and 1 hour unwrapped with sauce, all of which done at 250 Fahrenheit. The 3-2-1 is a template that leads to great ribs, but personally, I only really use this as a template. The first step for me is to put the ribs on a 250 Fahrenheit grill, and I like to bunch them up to make sure the rib is as thick as possible, because keep in mind, however you place something on the grill is how it's gonna cook. Then I smoke the ribs anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. What I'm looking for here is color. If you see them start to dry out, spray with apple juice, apple cider vinegar, water, or just a combination of any of those every 45 minutes or so. These ribs took about 4 hours to achieve the color I was looking for, at which point they were ready to wrap. The wrapping step speeds up the cooking process and keeps them tender, and I like to use tinfoil. Now, in terms of what to add to the wrap, a common combination is squeezed butter, brown sugar, and honey. Lay the ribs meat side down and wrap. Personally, I find all this excess butter and sugar completely unnecessary, and I usually just wrap with either barbecue sauce or whatever I'm drinking at the time, like a beer. All we need is a little bit of liquid to help them steam and tenderize. To allow them to braise, make sure to cook them meat side down here. Throw them back in the smoker or even an oven. At this point, they won't be absorbing any more smoke flavor. And after 1 hour, it's time to check for doneness. I'm gonna show you a few tips of how to know when your ribs are done. Man, these smell unbelievable. So the first test using a meat thermometer, it should feel quite tender. There should be a little bit of resistance, but they should go through pretty easily. Now here's the next test. As you can see, the bones are pulling away nicely. However, they're all still fully in there. They're not like completely falling out. When I touch the bones, I can just start to twist them. They definitely don't come clean out, but they are a bit loose, and that's a good sign that our ribs are cooked perfectly. And the final test is the bend test. But notice how when I bend these, there's a super extreme flop to it. They're kind of starting to crack, but they're not fully falling apart. This is the bend that I'm looking for. To finish these up, what I like to do is we have them flipped like so. We're gonna sauce just the top. Yes, I'm using Sweet Baby Ray's. Paint on a nice layer, and we're gonna pop these back in the oven for about 10 minutes just to tack up. So I just showed you what I consider to be perfectly cooked ribs. Now, let's check out our second rack. These here were the baby backs. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the term fall off the bone ribs. Interestingly, in competition and like more intense barbecue circles, fall off the bone is considered way overcooked. So this here is what I would consider to be fall off the bone. Really, the only difference is we left it in the wrap just a little bit further than we did the other ribs. You'll notice how the bones on this are already kind of poking through without me touching them at all. These bones come clean out. What I like about this is the meat isn't so overcooked that it's like pulled pork, but if you like your ribs fall off the bone, this is pretty much where you want to be. Despite being fall off the bone, we are going to treat these the exact same way. Flip them on that side and sauce them up. And these ribs are done. We have the St. Louis spare ribs. They've tacked up beautifully in the oven, and they look amazing. Let's just take a couple slices. Not gonna lie, those St. Louis cut ribs are going to be very hard to beat, but time for the baby backs. Take our slice. Even though these are completely fall off the bone, they still are filled with a lot of moisture. That great smoke ring, these look great. That is how to cook ribs in the smoker. But what if you don't have a smoker? Fortunately, it is very easy to cook ribs in the oven, and they always come out amazing. Since these are being cooked indoors with no smoke, you can skip the first unwrapped step. Simply season, wrap in tin foil, and place in an oven at 275F until they're tender. This should take anywhere from about 2.5 to 4 hours. Unwrap them, glaze with your favorite barbecue sauce, finish in the oven, and this is what you're left with. Another great option would have been to just slather these with sauce and finish on the grill, but as you can see, these honestly came out incredible for cooking 100% indoors. All right, well, we can't talk about pork ribs without talking about these prepackaged ribs that you find in the supermarket. Now, I'm assuming you probably think I hate these considering they're literally prepackaged and cooked ribs. However, I grew up on these things and personally, I think that they're absolutely delicious. Are they as good as home cooked ribs? Realistically not, but at the end of the day, I don't think I've ever had a rib I didn't finish, and these are no different. With these prepackaged ones, really all you have to do is throw them in the oven, and when they're done, they'll be super caramelized, really nice and tender. They're just a super nostalgic food for me. With our pork ribs complete, it is time to move on to the beef. Now we're gonna go over a few different methods, but by far my favorite is on the smoker, which is what we're gonna do to the back ribs, the dino ribs, and our chuck short ribs. For the back ribs, we're gonna treat them just like pork ribs, and today I'm going with no wrap. The chuck and dino ribs are actually gonna be treated more similar to a brisket. Smoke them low and slow, and really all I'm looking for is color. You can spray if they start to look dry, as we start to develop that really nice bark. After about 6 hours, the bark has been achieved. The internal temp at this point is around 175 Fahrenheit, but color is way more important than internal temp, and from here it's time to wrap. Okay, and with our short ribs wrapped, let's talk about how to cook our English cut and flanken style short ribs, starting with the English cut. Braised short ribs are simple, but they're a technique that everybody should understand because the concepts apply to braising anything. Season, then sear the short ribs over high heat to develop the crust. Remove, and then in the same pan, cook down celery, carrots, and onions. Add some garlic, then a tablespoon or two of tomato paste, which is packed with umami. Let that cook down, then deglaze the pan with red wine. You're gonna wanna scrape up all that flavor from the bottom, then add in beef stock, herbs, and finally re-add your short ribs. Put that over low heat or in a 250 Fahrenheit oven. Let that braise for a few hours until a thermometer slides through easily, just like butter. Strain the liquid of fat and reduce for the perfect sauce. Even though it takes a few hours, these things always come out unbelievable and are a really easy way to impress your guests. I mean, just check out how tender these were. But what about flanken style ribs? The most common way to eat these are with Korean barbecue, and they're known as galbi. The marinade's simple, but the most important thing is to add Asian pear or kiwi. These fruits have a natural tenderizing enzyme, and it makes a tough cut like short ribs super tender. I like to sear them over high heat on the grill, but you can also just cook them in a pan. Just make sure to get that beautiful color. And I'm telling you, if you have not tried these before, you absolutely need to. What I like about them is that they're completely different than all the other methods of cooking ribs. Try them and you will not be disappointed. And just like that, through the power of movie magic, our beef ribs are done. We'll start by opening up the chuck short rib. As you can see, tons of fat has come out and been absorbed by that paper. It looks and smells insane. And we'll also unwrap the dino ribs. Wow, sheesh. As you can see, the color on these is just absolutely perfect. That nice dark color, but still extremely tender. How do we know when beef ribs are done? Now with pork ribs, it is a little bit more tricky. There's a few tips and tricks you can use. Beef ribs, however, super simple. All you gotta do is use your thermometer and it should slide through with virtually zero resistance, almost like warm butter. We've reached right around 205 Fahrenheit. It took us close to 8 hours, so it definitely takes patience. But once we slice into this thing, you'll realize it was all worth it. And we'll start by taking a slice of our 4-bone chuck short rib. Let this rest for about 45 minutes. See what we got. Oh, it's so tender. I gotta say, those chuck short ribs did look incredible. I'm getting very hungry here, but it is time for the big kahuna, the dino ribs. These things, I got no words. I'm very excited. It's time to slice them up. And with all of our ribs finally complete, it's time for the taste test. If I learned one thing in this video, it's that the logistics of cooking about 15 different types of ribs
is not easy.
We have our taste tester, Ty. Here's the other thing. A lot of these ribs are gonna taste very similar to one another, so we'll see if I get any right. But the time is here. Kyle, please give me the first rib. Number 1. We're gonna say chuck short rib. Number 2. Definitely pork, I'll say St. Louis. Number 3. Genuinely, I have no idea. I'll say baby backs. This is very difficult. Number 4. Oh, easy, Galbi. Number 5. What the hell, man? Definitely beef, dino rib. Number 6. Lloyd's, Pashao. 7. Pork short rib. Number 8. Country style. Number 9. Chuck pork rib. Rib tip. Yep, absolutely the braised short rib. Okay. Whew. How many did I get right?
You did really good.
Did I really?
73%.
That is freaking unbelievable. I think that's the best I've done. All right, well, there it is. Really hope you guys learned something and enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to drop a comment and a like on this video, and we'll see you next time.